Hello and welcome to the second chapter on the London system. In the previous chapter, we had covered White's main line with d4, d5, bishop f4, knight f6, e3, c5, e3, e6. Sorry, we don't start with c5 because of the extra option of d into c5. e3, e6, knight f3, c5, knight bd2, knight c6, c3. And here we checked cd4, ed4, knight h5, which is the starting point of the main line, and we had covered the main line with bishop e3. In this chapter, we are going to be looking at White's alternatives in this position, as well as some sidelines on the sixth move. Let's start with the sidelines here, and we'll slowly go back to checking White's sidelines on the previous moves as well. So basically, we check the main line and then go backwards and check all the lines covering all the move order subtleties and transpositions, etc. So apart from c3, White's main alternatives here is bishop b5. There is c4. And I have included bishop d3, which is not a great move, but might be possible in one of your games. Let's start by looking at bishop b5, which I think is the most respectable sixth move alternative for White. White basically creates some pressure on the a4 e8 diagonal, and White wants to claim that either they are going to play knight e5 and spoiling our pawn structure on the queen side, or just put pieces on the better squares. White has a 4 versus 2 lead in development, so that means we can't take it very slight. Yeah, we have to pay some attention to this move, and we can take it in a light way. Now we have a couple of moves here. There is queen b6, which has been played by a lot of players, but I prefer the simpler bishop d7, where we develop a piece and basically stop White from spoiling our pawn structure. Queen b6 was an interesting alternative where we put pressure on White's bishop directly and make a threat. But the issue is White has the very strong c4 with the idea of playing a4 and a5, exploiting our queen and gaining space at the same time. And because of this very concrete idea, I don't want to go in the variation with queen b6. Therefore, I recommend starting with bd7, where we defend the knight, and now we want to play queen b6 because White is we may have some knight a5 ideas at some point, as the knight is not pinned here. White probably should castle here, and then we play bishop e7, get our last minor piece into the game. And apart from castling, we are also threatening knight h5, looking to win the bishop pair. As we have discussed repetitively in this course, bishop pair is an advantage for either side, especially if the position is open. And after winning the bishop, we will look to open up the center. So White needs to deal with the threat of knight h5 in some way. Computer's recommendation is d into c5, which has also been tried by some grandmasters. The main move here, though, is c3, and one of the possibilities is h3, looking to play bishop h2. Let's start by checking d into c5, where White claims that if we play knight h5, White wants to play bishop d6 and retain the pawn. We obviously don't allow White to do that, and thus we play bishop into c5. We recapture the pawn, and although we are not threatening knight h5 now, we have more space in the center. So now we have a strategic advantage of having more space, which means that our opening goals are fulfilled if White does not challenge it. So White's best idea here is to play c4 and challenge our center. Regardless of that, we can just play a6, looking to get the bishop out and then take on c4. So that knight c4 is met with b5, winning some material. And White needs to play bishop into c6 here to keep the balance. But after bishop into c6, winning the bishop pair, Black has absolutely no problems. We want to castle here and keep the bishop pair, but White will probably play knight b3 and knight d4 and challenge our bishop. which we will defend with rook c8, and we will have a balanced position on hand. If the position seems equalish, but at the same time we have many pieces on the board, so it's not completely dry, and we can still play for a win in this position. Let's go back to 8th move, where h3 seems like a good prophylactic move, but is very slow. We can now take on d4, white takes back, and because our development is complete, now we can bring our queen into the action with queen b6. White needs to either give up this pawn or the bishop pair with bishop c6, both of which are favorable outcomes for us, and we reach a position where we are strategically better. If white takes on c6, we take back, and then we want to castle, get the rook to the open file, and put some pressure on white's queen side. Let's go back to the 8th move, where white's main move is c3. White defends the d4 pawn and basically prepares against queen b6. But this allows us to castle. We might even play knight h5, but I wanted to set up a sneaky trap here. With short castle, we are threatening knight d4, which is very unexpected. The bishop on b5 is loose. We couldn't play this earlier because bishop d7 was threatened. But now with short castle, that is bishop d7 is not a check, and we will have knight f3 check. And after knight f3, we will take on d7, winning a pawn. If white plays h3 here, trying to save the bishop, we now win the pawn with knight into d4. If white takes, we take on f3, and we will take back on d7, winning a pawn. While if white plays something like knight into d4, we take on d4, and after bishop d7, we are not forced to take back on d7, but rather can play the strong intermezzo d3, preparing e into d2, retaining the extra pawn. And so on the 9th move, if white plays bishop d3 to get out of the knight d4 trick, white could also play queen e2, but our idea remains the same. We'll play knight h5 and win the bishop pair, followed by a strategically better position due to the pair of bishops in an open position. White does have some sort of advantage in activity, and so white is strategically, objectively fine. But from a strategic viewpoint, we are pressing due to the long-term factors. And if we are able to neutralize white's activity, we will have a better position. And that brings us an end to 6th move, bishop b5, which was white's most respectable sideline in this position. Playing c4 here is very much premature. With the bishop on b5, it made sense, but with the bishop on f1 and our knight on c6 directly eyeing for d4, this is just worse for white. We can quietly take on d4, and after e into d4, white has an isolated pawn, which we can try to exploit with d into c4. After this, we'll either put our bishop on b4 or to d6, trade one sets of pieces, castle, and play b6, bb7. White has an IQP position, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but you need your knight on c3 in such positions where it is actively placed, and this bishop to be on g5. The combination of bishop f4 and knight d2 is not healthy at all, and white's d4 pawn has extra problems. Plus, the knight on d2 is not doing anything, which means black has a comfortable game. Let's go back and check out white's last sideline here, which is bishop d3, where white wants to claim that if we play cd4, ed4, knight h5, white doesn't spend time on c3, and thus has more choices here rather than playing c3 and transposing back to the main line. However, this allows us to play the typical c4, where we gain space on the queen side, and after bishop e2, we play b5, and just by the looks of it, we know that our position is good due to the huge chunk of pawns in the center and on the queen side. We have more space, and our strategic goal would be to finish our development with bishop e7 and castle, followed by gaining more space with a5 and b4. And let's go back to the sixth move where white plays c3 and we play cd, ed and knight h5. By the way, c into d4 is not a great move because white's knight is on d2. So after bishop e7, we are threatening knight h5 and we may want to play queen b6 and put pressure on the b2 pawn. It seems like a very symmetrical pawn structure for white, but there is a critical difference that white's knight is on d2 and not on c3. From d2, it's not going to put pressure on us with knight a4, knight. Usually white puts pressure with knight a4 and knight c5. From d2, it's not doing anything, while our knight may start jumping around with knight a5 or maybe knight b4 in some situations. Knight b3 is not a good move in most of the positions because it can easily be attacked with a5 and a4. So there is a strategic rule where you don't want to put your knights on these four squares. So let me just highlight it in a better way for you. You don't want to put your knights on the following four squares because they can easily be attacked by the rook pawns. And in this position, that will be the case if white plays knight b3. And if white doesn't do that, we will play queen b6 and we will start pressing around on the b2 pawn. We will then castle. We will then castle, get the bishop out to d7 and bring the rook to the open file with rook f8. We had discussed this motive in one of the previous chapters as well, where we want to get the f rook to c8 and not the a rook to c8. Or else we will try to win the bishop pair with knight h5 and knight f4. The position is balanced, but and we have lots of pieces around, so the symmetrical pawn structure is not a problem as long as the knight is on d2. Another key idea which I forgot to mention is that this knight may jump to d6 where it belongs in these structures. The idea is where it is open to jumping around to c4 and e4, and the pawn on d6 in these QGD structures is very good. Let's go back to this move with 7th e into d4, knight h5. So we had checked bishop e3 in the previous chapter, and in this chapter, we will cover white's mainline alternatives with bishop g5, bishop g3, and bishop e5. Let's start by checking bishop e5. White's idea is that if we take on e5, the knight comes right into the game, attacking the knight on h5, and if the knight retreats, the bishop comes up with a check, forcing us to make another retreating move, and then white has a slight lead in development. We obviously ignore that and play f6, which is not a weakening move, but part of our strategy. We want the bishop to go back to g3, and now we can always play knight into g3 and win the bishop pair, followed by trying to push e5. However, in this position, we have an even impressive idea of playing g6, followed by bishop g7 and short castle. Why are we delaying knight g3? Because it's in our hands. We can take it anytime we want. Ideally, I would want to do that after white plays bishop d3 and short castle, so there is no pressure along the h file. If you remember, I had discussed the concept of keeping more flexibility, and this is precisely the situation. Knight g3 is a decision which I can make anytime, but I want white's rook to move from the h file, and at that precise point, I will take. This is a move which is not going anywhere, so I need not to be in a rush and take on g3. I'll play bishop g7 next, castle, and then play knight g3 followed by e5, where I would not be bothered by white's ideas of some bishop b5 tricks or some rook h7 bishop into g6 tricks, because all of my pieces are developed and my king is very safe. We remain better due to the possibility of getting the bishop pair as well as gaining space in the center. Let's go back and check bishop g3 here. And this is also a move which I don't like. It's better than bishop e5 because white is not provoking us to play f6, which is a useful move for us. But it's still not great The bishop is going to be dead in some point and will win the bishop pair. And as usual, we are going to take it on our terms and we'll play knight g3 when it's favorable for us. In this position, we start by playing bishop d7 because white was threatening bishop b5 and knight e5. When white had played bishop e5, we had f6, so we need not to be bothered with knight e5. But here knight e5 could have been a threat, which we prevented with bishop d7. At the same time, we are developing a piece, so it's not just a passive move. We are developing a piece and at the same time defending. That's all right. We don't want to make passive moves, but if a developing moves that does that role, it's completely fine. White probably develops a bishop and plays bishop d3. And now we take on g3. The point is after h into g3, we still play g6, followed by bishop g7 and castle. And after that, we would either strike open the center with e5 if white goes on the short side, or we may play f6 and e5 depending on the position's requirement. White cannot castle long because we will be very fast with b5 and b4. White doesn't have the dark square bishop, which is essential to attack in these positions. So the long side castling wouldn't bother us. And in positions with opposite side castling, so I'm expecting if white goes to the queen side, the side which makes threats first usually is better. And we are right in time with rook b8, b5 and b4 starting to attack white's weaknesses. White cannot touch this pawn easily, and making threats on the king side is much harder for white than for us to make threats on the queen side. Because of that and the pair of bishops, along with the better pawn structure, we are strategically better in this position, though white keeps some activity as compensation. And that brings us to the last sideline and the main line of this chapter, bishop g5. This has been played by lots of strong players, but I don't see the point of this move. White tempts us to play f6, which is very good for us. We want to play this move. So provoking us to do that just doesn't make sense. White's main move here is bishop e3, but players have tried knight e5 and bishop h4 as well. Knight e5 is the most ambitious line, but it is shut right down with g6, where we have no problems. We are looking to win material with knight e5 or f into g5. So white has to play knight into c6. If white plays bishop h4, this bishop is very poorly placed. We now bring our bishop to the active square, and basically white now has to take, allowing us to play bc6, where we have a great pawn chain in the center, and we will play c5, challenging white's pawn. The rook will come to b8 on a very active file, while this knight is ready to jump on f4, and basically all of black's pieces are getting activated. At the right time, we might even want to play e5 and gain space in the center. White basically has clearly worsened their position with knight e5 and knight into c6, so I see no reason for white players to try this out. And if white plays knight into c6 directly, we still play b into c6, and we are going to play e5 at some point. If white doesn't allow us, if white plays bishop h4, we'll play bishop d6 and transpose. If white plays bishop e3, we are going to play bishop d6 with the bishop d6 with the plan of either castling or playing knight g7, knight f5, improving the knight's position and winning the bishop pair. And that is it for this line with knight e5. White might try bishop h4, but this bishop is misplaced here, as we already know. We play bishop d6. So in general, whenever white plays bishop h4, we want to play bd6. The bishop is very actively placed, and as soon as this bishop moves, we'll lodge our knight to f4. If white plays bishop g3 to stop us from doing that, we take the bishop. Why? Because after h into g3, we are right in time to push e5 and gain space in the center. We remain better due to the pair of bishops and more space. And our idea is to just play e4, f5 and gain more space in the position. We'll definitely castle, and we are not bothered by white's possibilities of kingside attack because there is no dark square bishop, which means we'll be able to play g6 very comfortably. And after bishop d6, if white plays knight e5, we still play g6, and we know that knight into c6 is not a good move because after bc6, we get a great pawn chain in the center, and we are ready to play c5, undermine white's center. Knight f4 is the strongest move in the position, but it's just that I always want to be as consistent as I can, and so knight e5 g6 just look like the most logical choice to me. And that brings us to the main sideline with bishop e3, and we play bishop d6. We have already discussed this structure in great depth in the previous chapter. We wanted to play f7, f6, and white forced us to do that, so it should be a great thing for us. And because of that reason, I just find white's play not great at all. I think we have a much better version of the lines we wanted to get, and therefore I'm very surprised with lots of strong players trying this out earlier, but they don't try it out anymore because I think people have realized that this is very useful for black. The main move in this position is g3, as usual, trying to stop us from playing knight f4, but this creates a hook, which we have exploited in some lines in the previous chapter. Let's just look at the sidelines, possible sidelines in this position. If white plays bishop d3, we play the consistent knight f4, just like the previous chapter, where after bishop into f4, bishop into f4, we reach a structure which we know very well. Our idea is to play castle, and then, if you remember, we wanted to play f6, bd6, and e5. In this position, we have got f6 for free. So basically, we have all the same lines, just like all the same ideas, just like the previous chapter, with an extra tempo included. Definitely a favorable result for us. If white plays bishop b5, this time we can just play knight f4 since there is no knight e5. And if white castle, we can just castle. And our idea is that we want to play e5 at some. We want to play g5 this time, not e5, but g5. Why? Because the d5 pawn might be vulnerable, and white might have some chances to play bishop f4, ef4, and spoil our pawn structure. So let's say white plays rook e1, brings the rook to the open file. We now play king h8, which is a novelty, with the idea of pushing g5 and maybe vacating the g file for rook in some lines. We then want to play knight e7, knight f5, improving the other knight and trying to win the bishop pair. After that, we will develop this bishop, and once the bishops are traded, we'll get the other rook into the game, thus finishing our development and giving us a better position due to more space and better activity of the pieces. And let's go back to the last 10th move sidelines. Knight e5, as usual, we play g6, and we are very happy. If white plays knight d3, we go knight g7 and follow the plan which we already know, which is to put the knight on f5, castle, play b6, bb7, followed by queen c7 or queen d7 and rook e8. I'm not going too deep in at this point because we have just seen the same ideas in the previous chapter and we have a better position with f7, f6 included. So it just doesn't make sense to check the same lines again and again for you. And that brings us to the main line with g3, where white stops us from playing knight f4. If you remember, we played knight f6 and knight g4 for this when f7, f6 was not played. Here we don't have the chance, so we'll have to look for an alternative idea. And therefore, we castle, and our idea is very straightforward. We either want to gain space with e5 or start to attack this hook with f5 and f4 and trap the bishop or spoil white's kingside pawn structure. White's main move in this position is bishop g2, fianchetting the bishop, but there is bishop d3, which is the most ambitious move, and a small sideline with knight h4. This was played by Levon Aronian, where white is threatening to win the knight, but we just played g6, followed by the typical idea of getting the knight back, so as to reroute it to f5. In this position, we can't do that because the knight is on h4, so we'll have to play g5, gaining space, forcing the knight to go back, and then playing knight f5, where we'll have a better position due to more space and better activity of the pieces. If white plays bishop e2, yeah, we'll play knight g7 followed by g5. And white's strongest move here is bishop d3, but usually when you play g3, you want to put the bishop on g2. White's idea is that we can play e5, but then white has knight into e5 with a forced draw. I don't want to allow that. And so we start by playing queen e8, defending the bishop, and renewing the threat of playing e5. If white castles, now we don't play e5. It's possible, but after c4, the complications prefer white. White has some c into d5 ideas, and white has developed all the minor pieces while we don't have our minor pieces developed. So this opening of center can be beneficial for white in a strategic sense. But we'd rather play f5. And now we are looking to exploit the hook on g3. If white plays knight b3, making space for the bishop, we gain space and play f4, threatening the bishop. The bishop goes back. Now, although we have more space and some weaknesses to attack on the king side, our pieces on the queen side are not yet developed. We want to bring all of our pieces into the game, and thus we start by playing a5, looking to exploit this knight on b3. If you remember, we had discussed the same motif in this position. Let me show you this. We had discussed this motif while discussing this position where knight comes to b3 and we can play a5, a4. Having a knowledge of these strategic ideas is a great addition to your arsenal, where you basically know these concepts and can apply it in numerous possible games, right? The structure is different, the position comes from a different line, but the concept of attacking the knight on the knight files on the third rank with the rook pawns can be a very useful tool. And basically after bishop g5, bishop f6, bishop e3, bishop d6, g3 castle, bishop d3, queen e8, castle f5, knight b3, f4, bd2. We have a completely different pawn structure, but the concept of attacking the knight and gaining more space on the other flank remains the same. White plays a4 to stop that from happening because this knight does not have a good square. d3 would have been good square for knight, just like the d6 square for our knight, but unfortunately it is occupied by other piece. And now we want to start targeting these weaknesses on the queen side, and thus we play knight f6 with the idea of playing queen h5 followed by knight g4. Another useful idea of playing a5 was that in many positions we were able to swing the rook after pushing b6. That was the secondary idea of a5, which was very deep but also made a lot of sense. And black remains better here due to more space and safer king. Let's go back to white's main line with bishop g2, where white fianchettos the bishop. But as usual, this is the hook. The bishop doesn't have space to move to. And we play f5, threatening to play f4 and win material. Yeah. Now white has two moves. White has to move the knight somewhere in order to attack this knight. White can't play castle, where after f4 we are just dominating. And so let's look at the knight jumps. Knight g5 is the weaker of the knight jump because the knight is not doing anything here. And we just play queen e8, renewing the threat of f4. If white plays f4, we now have a great outpost on e4, which we try to exploit with knight f6. We will then play h6, force this knight to go back, and then put our knight to e4, followed by exploiting this weak diagonal by playing b6 and bishop a6. After that, we might play knight a5, try to fight for this square, or play b5, b4, undermine white's pawn structure on the queen side. Black is slightly better here due to more active pieces. This bishop is bad, and so is this bishop, as well as the potential to attack white's position. So knight e5 is the main move here, which is most principled, but is objectively even worse than knight g5. But I would say if you have gone for bishop g2, you want to make the more principled move and see if black is able to exploit that or not. Fortunately for us, we can do that by playing f4 and trying to win the bishop. Now white has two moves. There is knight c6 and the more principled queen h5. Let's start by checking knight into c6, b into c6. So white has traded off the active knight, but at least white won't have a poor pawn structure in the position with queen h5 on 13th move, where we play fe, fe and bishop e5. The drawback, however, is that white has opened up the b file for us here after f4, knight c6, bc6, queen h5. The b file is opened up, which we exploit after fe3, fe3, and rook b8. White wanted to play castle, long castle, but after this threat, it's not easy to play that, and the king is stuck right in the center of the board. If white plays knight b3 here, trying to defend the b2 pawn, we as usual use the same motive of playing a5 and harassing the knight, after which we will have a very strong attack with queen b6, queen b2, or a4, rook into b2. If the queen goes back, we get our queen into the game with the threat of playing bishop a6 and a4, getting all of the pieces right into the attack. White's king is stuck in the center, while if we are able to open up the position with e5, we'll have pair of bishops and an open position, as well as the king right in the center. So the material deficit of just one pawn wouldn't matter. And if white plays here b4, trying to play long castle, we can exploit that the pawns on the queen side are weak by playing a5. If white plays a3, we want to play a into b4 and open up the position, but how do we do that in a good way? By playing rook a8, followed by a into b4, where white is worse due to the poor positioning of the king. White has no good way to maintain the rook on the a file, and if the rook moves, we will just start penetrating through the a file with rook a3, attacking the weakness on c3. Computer recommends playing g6 here, but I don't see the point of it personally, because the weaknesses are here on the queen side and the queen was out of the game. So I'm not really bothered with it on being on h5. Plus, it's not a logical move. I want to be as logical as I can. And with rook 8, I was actually making a logical move, trying to exploit white's weaknesses on the queen side. That being said, you can obviously play g6. And that brings us an end to this variation with b4, basically 13th knight c6. And we go back to check white's queen into h5 here, which is the second one of the main move in this position. We now play f into e3, spoil white's pawn structure, but white is a pawn up, and take on e5, force white to take with the pawn, ruining their pawn structure in the process and creating some dark square weaknesses. The obvious idea is to play queen b6 here, but the issue with queen b6 is after long castle, we can't take on e3 because after rook he1, white has got all the pieces into the game. We don't want white to get the pieces into the game, and therefore we start with bishop d7, threatening to play bishop e8 and winning the pawn on e5, keeping white's weakness on e3 alive. So if I have an option of taking the e5 pawn or e3 pawn, I would want to take the e5 pawn because the e3 pawn is a backward pawn, while the pawn on e5, if this pawn goes away, might actually not be such a bad pawn. So with bishop d7, we are threatening to play bishop e8 and knight e5. And if white plays long castle, now we can penetrate on the 7th rank with rook f2. On the next move, we'll play bishop e8 if it's possible. And if white plays bishop h3, we will play g6 and win this pawn. Once that is done, black remains better due to more space and better pawn structure. And that brings us an end to this chapter, a relatively short one, but an important chapter where we cover white's alternatives for the main line. Let me just summarize it up very quickly. So we start by looking at white's 6th move alternatives in the London system. And if white plays bb5, threatening knight e5, we start by playing bd7, defending against the spoiling of pawn structure. After short castle, bishop e7, we want to play knight h5, or we want to castle long and castle short and play queen b6. If white plays c3, cd, ed, cd is not great because the knight on d2 is misplaced. Ed, we play knight h5. Both bishop e5 and bishop g3 aren't great as we will win the bishop pair. And our idea for bishop g3 is to play bd7 followed by g6, knight g3 and bg7. While against bishop e5, f6, bishop g3, we will play g6, bishop g7, knight into g3 and e5, where we remain better due to more space, pair of bishops, better pawn structure. If white plays bishop g5, we basically get a better version of 8's bishop e3 since we have f6, f7, f6 included. And bishop d3 runs into knight f4, while g3 runs into castle, followed by f5 or e5. That's it, guys. And I'll see you in the next chapter where we go through white's other sidelines and move order subtleties in the London system.